pleasure to be able to introduce Mike Lynch, who works with me here at the Forest Stewards Guild. Mike actually works up in the Lake States, but given his GIS acumen, he's been helping corral the data for our 2019 fire season review and digging in and looking at some of the sort of overview summaries from this past year. So I'll stop sharing, and Mike, you should be able to jump in here and share your screen and unmute yourself and dive in.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep, your sound coming through loud and clear.
Okay, well, glad to hear it here. And well, thank you for the introduction, Zander. As he mentioned, we'll talk here for the next about 15 minutes about a report. And let me actually go to the next slide. It shows a couple pictures of
your slides. You haven't shared your screen yet.
Oh, it doesn't show the screen?
Nope, not yet.
Share.
There we go.
That. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So if we, is it working?
It hasn't gone, it's still on the title slide.
Okay, I apologize here. It won't let me advance slides. Maybe if I just click through, no. No, the standard webinar fiasco here.
We'll get it.
Oh, here we go. I think
there you go.
You know what? Okay. Yep. So this is going to be, I think, the 8th version of the Southwest fire season overview that we've been working to pull together here, the 2019 edition. And so looking forward to kind of going through a little bit of this information with you guys here now. And then look for that. Looks like the previous dates here have all been kind of May, and we don't have the pictures from 18 on this at this point. But yeah, figure that'll come out here relatively soon. So here's an overview kind of looking across 2002 through 2019. And keep in mind for this data, and I'll mention that again, you know, you'll see different numbers in different places. For this report, we've defined the Southwest as Arizona and New Mexico. But as you saw on Zander's map a moment ago of the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, it includes part of West Texas, et cetera. So at least for this report, figure that we're just looking mostly at Arizona and New Mexico. And you can see 2019, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer here on the screen, but 2019 lines up generally along an average number, certainly not as high as 2011 or as low as 2015. And here are some kind of overall information about the fires. So we had nearly 460,000 acres in those two states in 2019. Large majority of that was in Arizona, and a large majority of that was in the single Woodbury fire, which was almost 124,000 acres. But you can see, you know, almost 380,000 acres in Arizona, and so essentially 300,000 more acres than New Mexico in 2019, which was actually kind of inverted from 2018, which saw more of these fires in New Mexico. Almost half of the Arizona fires were identified as human-caused fires, and that you can see how these compare to the 10-year kind of averages. So New Mexico is way below a 10-year mean, and Arizona was actually above the 10-year mean. And prescribed fire was much higher than average over the last 10 years in Arizona, where it was a little bit below in New Mexico. So what we do for this report is we kind of look at the largest fires and hope that those represent at least a cross section of what was going on in the fire season throughout the region. And so what that looked like in 2019 was looking at the 12 largest fires, and those were the fires that in largest we define as acres, and those acres were, for this report, 8,000 acres and larger. And so I believe the triple nickel fire up by Albuquerque was just a little bit above 8,000 acres, so that was the smallest one in this report. And the Woodbury fire east of Phoenix was just under 124,000 acres. So certainly keep that scaling in mind whenever we're talking about these fires as well, is that, that Woodbury fire is, much more, many more acres than some of these other fires. But you can see they're kind of scattered around. Only 3 of those largest fires were in New Mexico this year, whereas the remaining 9 were in Arizona, scaling from up by the Grand Canyon on down a little further south. So just to give an overview, certainly there are better folks to get information on precipitation trends and climatic information, but wanted to highlight a kind of an interesting component of the 2019 season is heading into, so coming out of 18 and into 19, significant drought throughout much of the southwestern region here. However, you can see this image here is from the first quarter of 2019. And so you can see how much of Arizona and the northern part of New Mexico was either above average or much above average for precipitation, which has kind of a couple different directions. Certainly we were seeing reports from the Woodbury fire in particular that although only 3%-ish of that fire was identified as being a grass cover type, there was reports that this wet spring helped lead to a proliferation of grasses throughout all community types there. So there's certainly that. However, it also is decreasing the overall drought component. And so also pulled into this report, the details of this figure are probably not necessary. I think the most important thing is to look at that there's 3 different lines, and the red line is the maximum. And so this is the energy release component. So the red line's the maximum, the gray line is our average, and then 2019 is in the blue. And you can see as a result of that, a variety of conditions, the El Nino and that wet spring, that we're well below that average line and way below the max line for the first half of 2019. And we added in here the Woodbury start and Woodbury end. And so you can see that's quite a ways below that average line. And so that fire could have potentially been even larger had we been at average or up towards the maximum. But then one thing I also wanted to show here on this figure, and again, the details maybe aren't as important as just watching where these lines go, is that the latter part of 2019 was one of the hotter and drier on record. And so you can see where that blue line after essentially July 1 surpasses the average and stays above, with the exception of a dip here in late September, and approaches that maximum the rest of the way. So that's just kind of give you an overview. We can flip through these, but just to give the idea that what we're looking at for pulling this report is a variety of data. The ravage data, we're looking at the ICS 209s, which are useful for giving some perspective there. Some of the burned area emergency response imagery for the soil burn severity, and other sources for historical fire data. So what I'll do here is just bring up a couple different images, and then we'll talk across the trends. And so one thing, and you'll notice here I didn't put a legend on this because to show what the different land fire vegetation covers are, because it could get kind of hard to interpret on this map. But what I want to highlight is just the difference, which all of you fire folks realize that there's a difference in community types, but I also want to use that later on. And so, for instance, this woodbury fire, the tan, I guess you'd call it maybe a brownish gray, that's all chaparral. And so this huge fire burned mostly in chaparral and some scrub, and then the kind of lime green here is pinon juniper. And so as a comparison, if we look at something like the Coldwater fire, again, there's no list of what these community types are on the side here, but that light green that you can see throughout the entire Coldwater fire area was ponderosa pine, and so a much different community for this fire to burn in. And so then bringing forward, here's the map of our 12 largest fires, or a figure, and what kind of communities these burned in. So, certainly looking at the woodbury as this pure blue color, and you can see chaparral, scrub, pinon, juniper, and it's a huge amount, so it made chaparral be the most frequently burned cover type in 2019. However, certainly if you look at excluding woodbury, you can see where that would drop way down. And then, for instance, that map we just looked at of the Coldwater was almost exclusively ponderosa pine. So this kind of just gives you a general idea across the different communities. And in this year, in the 2019 report, we saw virtually 0 acres in spruce fir, which is different than what we were seeing in the 2018 report with some of those fires. So some of the other data to look at here would be the ravage canopy mortality. And so here's the Coldwater fire. So this is that fire that was in primarily a ponderosa pine community. And you can see this green, and I did include a legend here on the right-hand side of this image. And you can see the green is showing essentially dark green, 0%, lighter green, 0 to 25%, and then isolated pockets of real high canopy mortality. Versus a fire such as the Pine Lodge fire, you can see a much higher canopy mortality component in there in pockets of that fire. But keep in mind that this is a canopy metric, and that doesn't necessarily take into account what that canopy is made up of. And so that's what in our report we try and look at where those canopy mortalities line up with high stature vegetation types like a ponderosa pine community, or if it's going through areas of grass or chaparral or something that quickly grow back again. So here's the figure for all of these fires. Now keep in mind, only 8 of these fires had ravage, 8 of the 12 had that data. Woodbury is pretty evenly spread across there, but you can almost visually subtract that, to look at some of these other fires as well. But you can see the vast majority of these areas actually were showing little to no canopy mortality. And so I forget what the number is if you put these 2 farthest to the left bars together, but it's relatively low. And then in this farthest over group, you certainly see the Woodbury fire coming in with a lot of that chaparral component there, but then also the Sheridan fire, which had a pretty high canopy mortality. And so that brings up, so here's the image of that canopy mortality in the Sheridan fire. This was a somewhat interesting one to look at, in that we had this Hyde fire from 2019 coming in on the northern side, and then it reburned much of this Stubbs fire from 2018. And so you can see kind of these 3 fires coming together here. But looking at this, you're seeing, okay, well, there's almost complete canopy mortality in, for instance, this southern spur. And one thing we also wanted to pull in were some of these soil burn severity maps. And so we pulled those for as many of the fires as it was available. And you can certainly see that there is still high severity of this soil burn in, for instance, the southern spur of the Sheridan fire. But you can see that a lot more of it falls under this moderate to even some low severity. And so that ties back into that, what is the plant community type that's dominating these. So here's the, I guess it was 7 fires that had the soil burn severity data available for. Low severity was the most common. I think one of the particularly interesting things is there was a tiny bit of high severity in the Pine Lodge, but other than that, the Sheridan was the only other fire that had any of these 7 fires that we had for this that had a high severity. And getting towards wrapping up, because I think I'm getting to the end of my time here, but just looking at a few other components that we wanted to look at would be things like the vegetation condition class. And so this is looking at a metric of departure from historic conditions. And the majority, and this is an example so you can see where this kind of lines up, with the green being a low departure and then ranging up to the red being a high departure. And here's the 12 fires. And so a large portion of them fell into this low departure from historic conditions. Few fires, the Ikes fire and Castle fires were identified as pretty significant components of those burn areas, falling under this high departure category. And I believe that is kind of what I had here, trying to paint a real broad picture of some of those trends. Certainly will be here at the end of this webinar if Zander is opening up for some questions on any of that data in particular, but that's kind of what I had so far.
That's great, Mike. Thank you so much. I used to work on this report, and it's a pleasure to see Mike handle it because he did a better job than I used to do. So it's a nice to get that overview, and hopefully, I think we'll hold questions. I didn't see any come in the chat window yet. So we'll hold questions and discussions till after maybe our next presenter. And with that, I wanted to turn it over to Rich Naden. And I actually failed to get a full biography to introduce Rich, but remembering from past years, Rich is a real expert on both meteorology more generally, but also fire weather specifically here in the Southwest. He has a couple of emails, wears a couple of hats, but I believe his home is with the National Weather Service, although he does do fire meteorology on incidents as well. And I should probably just turn it over to him. But the last thing I'll say is he's a real asset to those of us working and living in the Southwest, and certainly a resource for all of us trying to understand how weather and fire come together. So thank you so much, Rich, for being willing to present a little bit on what we might expect for this coming season.
Thanks, Zander. I appreciate that. I'm going to try to get my screen shared here. Let's see here. I've got so many things going. Okay.
All right. Looks like it's coming up.
So I guess to just jump on top of what Zander just mentioned a moment ago, I'm actually a Park Service employee. So I've been employed by the Park Service since 2003. And previous to that, I was a National Weather Service employee for about 4 to 5 years. And then I worked in the private sector a couple years ahead of that after graduate school. So kind of jumping around the country a little bit, but I've been in the Southwest now for almost 17 years or 18 years now. So it's been a while. So as Zander said, one of the things I do, or one of the primary jobs I do, is kind of keeping up with the conditions across the region, and also looking at climatologically, how they compare with the past, and really what the expectation can be for a fire season. And then once we're heading into the fire season, keeping up with the daily weather forecasts, and kind of keeping the coordinating group and others at the coordination center especially briefed in regards to what the upcoming conditions are, weather patterns, anomalous events type stuff, like things like that. So really kind of keeping keeping an eye on things constantly to a certain extent is kind of what I'm doing. So unfortunately, what I'm about to present is almost a month old, so I apologize about that, but that I think is just a consequence of the timing of this. So I'm actually starting to work on an update for early May, the last seasonal update for this fire season, and it should be on the internet up on the SWIC website probably early next week. But I'll kind of touch a little bit on some of the changes I'm seeing during this discussion or during this presentation, and just kind of just go from there. So again, what I'll be discussing today is kind of this fire season's consideration and outlook overall. And I'm one of two fire weather meteorologists housed at the Southwest Coordination Center and part of the predictive services unit for the Southwest area. So we'll be going over the 5 primary fire potential main factors across the region here. And this is something we've been doing for probably more than a decade now to kind of get a regular aspect of reviewing these things annually. And jumping back to last season, I mean, wow, what a difference a year makes. I mean, we had, like, I think the graph that was shown a little bit ago, some of those precipitation numbers were just absolutely anomalous across the northern tier of the area into Colorado and Utah. I mean, I know I was skiing last year into late April in southwestern Colorado. So the moisture up last winter and spring was just crazy. And I think that had a direct relation in regards to our fire season last year and how it was kind of just a slow season overall beyond the uptick in prescribed burns, but also how it related to the late onset of the monsoon and the drier late July and August into September that we saw across the region. Mother Nature always seems to have a way of kind of balancing the scales, if you will. So when Mother Nature has a wet spring, it doesn't necessarily going to give you a wet summer. And that was kind of what we were expecting last year, that would, kind of have a poor fire season, if you will, or kind of inactive to a certain extent. And then perhaps, the exclamation point was kind of a poor summertime monsoonal pattern. That's exactly kind of what occurred. So jumping into this year, number 1, drought. We'll be going over that for a little bit. Thereafter, looking at the fine fuels conditions across the area, at least the best we can. Looking at what's gone on, factor number 3, with the seasonal temperature precipitation setup for the past 3 or 4 months. Number 4, what's been going on with the weather pattern and what can be the weather pattern expectation as we head into early summer time frame. And then what's the possibility of the monsoon for this coming summer. So factor number 1 here with drought, again, this is one of those factors that's obviously always changing, but all these are constantly changing, but this one changes a little less quickly overall. So in the upper left, there's kind of the 6-month change map that we monitor from the CPC in Washington. And the middle portion, the left portion of the screen is the U.S. drought monitor. Again, I apologize about the dated aspect. This is about a month old, but that's just the way it goes this time of year. And then the bottom left is a seasonal drought outlook. So really now focusing in the upper left initially here, it's really been kind of an up and down drought regime over the past half year or so. So in general, as you can see across much of the state of Arizona, we've seen wetter conditions for the past 6 months, really up into the past 3 to 6 weeks. We've had a kind of a wetter signal in Arizona west of the Countless Divide. And then you can see the drier signal starting to take grip there across the Four Corners area and across the northern tier of New Mexico. And that's something that continues here into the U.S. drought monitor as of late March, and really as of today, kind of a severe drought type setup across northern, northeastern Arizona through the Four Corners. We've seen some improvement in the Four Corners the past couple of weeks, and then protruding eastward across the northern tier of New Mexico into the northeastern plains of New Mexico and the far western portions of the Oklahoma Panhandle, northwest Texas area. So really the severe drought area for this fire season, or moving into the main fire season here, is across the northern third to quarter or so of the area at this time. The bottom left there, the official seasonal drought outlook. Again, this is as of late or mid to late March. The expectation was at that time to continue to see persisting drought across that northern tier area, or most of that drought area, from the U.S. drought monitor. But when in northeastern New Mexico, perhaps some areas of improvement there with that greenish area right there across northeastern New Mexico into the adjacent states of Kansas and Texas and Oklahoma. Really, those areas across the northeastern Arizona into northern New Mexico, some hydrological issues with a longer term drought, and the shorter term more of just a fine fuels type issue across northern northeastern New Mexico. But the overall expectation is that drought area is likely to continue into the main fire season across that northern tier. We've seen some improvement across southern Utah and the southwestern Colorado the past 6 weeks or so with some of these weather systems, but I don't think it's going to be enough to wipe the drought away the next 6 weeks. So jumping into factor number 2, the fine fuels for the present fire season. One way we like to categorize this is by going back and looking at the past summer or main precipitation seasons. Was it wet or was it dry? So we're looking back at last summer, the upper portion of the slide here, June through October. And if you just eyeball those charts, overall, you can look at the compilation picture in the far upper right, June through October, quite dry. And again, this is what I was talking about a few minutes ago with the wet season or normal wet time frame during the monsoonal season. Last year was not anywhere close to that. You can see that these really, the reddish areas here are indicative of well below normal precipitation during June through October of 2019. So really, this is one measure that we look at in regards to kind of ascertaining
Whoops, Rich, your audio cut out.
How about now?
Yeah, we can hear you again. Thanks.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there, but I guess might be my internet connection, but hopefully that continues to be okay here. So let's jump into a couple of these bullets here. So last year, that below normal carryover of the warm season of fine fuels was driven by those low precipitation totals last July through September. However, despite poor precipitation last summer and fall, the recent and continued up and down weather pattern has contributed and will continue to contribute to widespread green up. Now in Arizona especially, we've seen a lot of curing of these finer fuels, and in some portions of the southern deserts of Arizona, especially on the lower portions of the Tano and some of the adjacent BIA lands, they have right now record or near record to record areas of fine fuels growth and continuity in some of those lower desert areas. And interestingly enough, some of this is a result of the carryover fuels from 2018 into 2019, as well as what they've seen growth-wise in the wetter winter that they've had in Arizona the past 6 months. So despite overall kind of a normal to perhaps below normal fuel loading regionally, the southern deserts of Arizona can be categorized as near record fine fuel loadings this year. And we've already seen, in fact, so far as of right now, our main significant fire activity has occurred on the Tano through late April recently and into some of the BIA territories adjacent to the Tano in these low to mid elevation fine fuels regimes so far this fire season, which is just getting started. So that kind of covers that last bullet at the bottom right there. Overall, we categorize the fine fuel loading this year as normal to below average or below normal, especially across the northern tier of the area, but loading is well above normal to above normal across the far south. And this actually includes some of the desert territories of perhaps like the Deming-Lordsburg and poking eastward as far as the Lincoln National Forest and to some of the adjacent plains areas of southeastern New Mexico and West Texas as well. Next slide shows a little bit of what I'm getting at in regards to these record fuels across portions of the Tano. This particular slide just shows the red brom starting to cure in some of these areas here. And this was a month ago. So here we are a month later. A lot of the red brom areas has certainly cured significantly, especially in the past couple of weeks with the temperatures perking up recently. Similar kind of a seasonal curing of the fine fuels here across the Tano. You can see that quite plethora and continuous amount. Continuity is very good there. across these low to mid elevation areas of the Tano. So they've already seen an uptick in the beginning of the fire season over there, and this will be a player for weeks and perhaps into the main core fire season of June into July until the monsoon arrives. So getting a little more geeky or technical here, and I'll try to go over this slide a little more quickly. It's always important to get a kind of a broad-based perspective of where you're at in regards to the oceans and what's going on with El Nino Southern Oscillation. So in the upper left here is kind of a portrait of what was occurring for the far upper left is the sea surface temperature pattern across the globe. And these are the actual temperatures in the far upper left, and the anomalies just beneath that, and a loop occurring here from approximately early January through mid to late March of this year. And overall, I have that circled area there showing kind of the warmer tongue or the warmer areas protruding from, as you can see from Hawaii. There's the Hawaiian Islands there northward, kind of a warm area in the northern Pacific. And this has kind of been an area that's been persistently warm for a couple of years now. And the area of importance in the 3.4 Nino region, which is one area that a lot of scientists monitor for the warmth or the lack of warmth for the El Nino. Right now it's kind of in a neutral state. As you can see, the end of that loop there, the warmer or the above normal temperatures or anomalous temperatures kind of fade away a little bit. So we're more of a normal ENSO regime right now when you look at the overall broad picture. In the upper right here is more of just a look back at the last 2 decades in regards to what's gone on with the swings and on La Nina with the blue and the El Nino in regards to the warming of the central to tropical Pacific. In the last 5 years especially, we've seen more El Nino than we've seen La Nina for sure. The bottom right here is just kind of a portrait of some of those important areas that are monitored by scientists in regards to categorizing what's going on with ENSO. And there's the important Nino 3.4 region right there. And then again, this is dated, so I apologize about that, about a month old now, but the overall consensus with a lot of these models is showing that we're going to be going through kind of a neutral regime in the near future, and perhaps later this summer into the fall. Some of the models are showing the sea surface temperature values becoming more weak La Nina-ish by late summer into the fall of 2020. So we'll see how that pans out, but that would definitely have an impact on the late fire season, but more so the fall of this year. So diving into factor number 3 here, briefly looking at what occurred with temperature and precipitation for late last year through late March. Again, a month or so old here. So precipitation is in the lower left, temperatures in the upper left. So overall, looking at temperatures for that approximately 3-month time frame from New Year's Eve through late March, kind of a hodgepodge temperature regime here with cooler than normal across the southern tier, southern half of Arizona, as well as some southern sections of New Mexico and the eastern plains, and perhaps some areas here of a few degrees above normal across the remainder of the area for high temperatures the last 3 or so months as of late March. For precipitation, we can see that wetter signal, especially across the southern southeastern portions of New Mexico, out towards the Divide area, and across southwestern and western Arizona. This area especially got hit hard with a few systems in February and March, really kind of setting the tone for some of those increased fine fuels that they're seeing right now. So diving into just the past 30 days, and again, this is the past 30 days from approximately late February through late March, we can see kind of the cool regime here west of the Continental Divide taking grip as of during that time frame, and kind of a warmer signal from the Divide eastward in high temperatures as of late February through late March. You can see the warming, especially in southern and southeastern Colorado and the plains of Oklahoma and West Texas. And here's that really wet period that we saw in late February through late March across the western deserts of Arizona, and poking eastward along the Mogollon Rim area into Coconino and as far east as the Apache Sitgraves area. And then we had a kind of a dry tongue from the White Mountain Gila area east-northeastward through central northern New Mexico up towards northeastern plains and southeastern Colorado. And then an anomalous huge wet area from southeastern Arizona eastward across southern New Mexico into southeastern New Mexico and far west Texas. So really kind of an interesting smattering of anomalous conditions across the region as of late March. I'm going to kind of jump through this briefly here, but this is just kind of showing what the ERC values were for a couple different PSAs, or predictive services areas as we call them, again, as of late March. Now, recently, these below average ERC values as of late March kind of have risen more to near normal, and in some instances slightly above normal as of late April. So I'll just make that note real brief. As of late March 2020, here's a quick glance at some of the snowpack figures across the region. Overall, snowpack, we're not doing very well here in the bottom right across the Gila White Mountain area, the Lincoln National Forest, and most of the southern forests were not doing very well in regards to snowpack as of late March. You can see 43% of normal, 37, 8% of normal, 14. However, portions of the Coconino northward to the Kaibab Plateau as of late March was well above average, 100 to 150% of normal. And you can see that reaches into southern Utah here with some of these areas about 120 to 140% of normal. Northern New Mexico overall was near to perhaps slightly below normal in regards to snowpack as of late March. And these are some of the river basins across the geographic area here. In general, below normal for the most part across Arizona, with the exception of the Coconino and Kaibab Plateau area, and generally near normal to slightly below normal across much of New Mexico, with the exception of kind of the Gila area and perhaps portions of the Jemez, well below normal to below normal. So diving into factor number 4 here, what's upcoming or what's likely upcoming as we go through the next few months. Again, this is the forecast I put together in late March. I'm actually working on a new one later this week. So as of late March, the expectation was for temperatures to generally see a near normal temperature pattern for the most part for the forecast time frame of April through July. And looking at the bottom left here, the expectation was to see kind of a near normal precipitation signal from that same time from April through July, with perhaps a mosaic of above and below from the Continental Divide area northward through Colorado, Utah, into Wyoming and southern Montana. So kind of a mosaic up and down at times with some of these weather systems moving from west to east across that area. So in general, we're continuing to see kind of a variable weather pattern, especially as I look further onward into May here. We saw kind of a, really up until a couple of weeks ago, Arizona was coolish. They were struggling. Interestingly enough, Phoenix, their first 90-degree day was just last Wednesday. So about a week ago today was the first day they hit 90, and they hit 100 just a couple of days later, which is the fastest increase from 90 to 100. When you look back 112 years, that's only happened 4 times from what I've read. So really quick increase in temperatures west of the Continental Divide recently, but before that, we really were coolish in Arizona for much of the winter and spring. So I'm expecting this kind of up and down pattern to continue as we go through late April now into May. So that kind of goes along with the central portion of the slide of expected continued strong variability over the next month or so, with generally a drier pattern to emerge overall by this coming month in a few days and well into June. So this neutral ENSO pattern remains to be intact. It's expected to linger well into the summertime with that weak La Nina possible by the fall. So this was, again, this was last month's forecast that I put together with a guy down in Atlanta at the Works of the Southern Area Coordination Center. These were the expectations for April, May, June, and July as of late March for both temperature in the upper portion and precipitation in the lower portion. But in general, the expectation for our area here in the Southwest is for near normal to above normal temperatures as we head into May and June, and likely a drier than normal type signal in the large scheme of things overall. And hopefully when we get into July, we see this type of pattern set up where we get the monsoonal flow from south to north with perhaps a cooler signal there from the southern Rockies to the northern Rockies, and a good wetter signal here from south to north from the deserts from our area northward into the northern plains and far northern Rockies. So we'll see how that pans out, but I'll touch upon that more in a minute. Again, this is also dated as of late April or late March, sorry, but let's just discuss this briefly as it kind of shows or exemplifies the 500 millibar height pattern. And here's kind of the colors are indicative of the anomalous height pattern for the 500 millibar height area. So in general, this is the expectation for April and the May of kind of a low setup there south of the Aleutian Island chain, and an upper level high off the west coast, and a weak subtropical branch lows kind of undercutting that high, with more of a low pressure center across the central portion of the country. And this pattern still kind of remains to be accurate, even as I go back and look a month later now. It seems to be still pretty good resemblance to what we're seeing right now, as even today we're seeing a pretty deep upper level low across the Midwestern or the mid portion of the country, with an upper level high protruding across the west coast. And we'll still see these weak lows trying to undercut this upper level high across the west coast, and that's going to be an interesting pattern as we continue into the month of May here shortly. So again, the take home with this is kind of a variable weather pattern. This was short term across the Intermountain Western areas of the country, with that mid upper level trough in the mid portion of the country. And this type of setup typically will allow us backdoor cold frontal activity from east to west across the area. So I do think we'll continue to see some backdoor cold fronts dropping from northeast to southwest. Looks like we had one yesterday, and we have another one towards next Monday or Tuesday. And that pattern looks to be continuing probably well through May. Next bullet here, expect on and off breezy to windy conditions, and that was last month. And as May and June arrive, more regular ridging. We're certainly seeing the ridging right now with the record to near record warmth across many areas of the region the next couple of days. And then in regards to the monsoon, a significant amount of uncertainty always exists with the monsoonal pattern. Last year, we had a pretty good idea that it was going to be delayed and weak, and that turned out pretty well. With that was the result of the record rainfall that we saw throughout much of the winter and spring. But this year, it's a little less certain. I would say there's a pretty high likelihood it should be rather timely to maybe slightly delayed this summer, and perhaps centered along and east of the Continental Divide overall. That's kind of some things I've been watching and getting some take homes from some of the analog years I researched. And here's just the last bullet, the last factor here, number 5, the monsoon. I just kind of touched upon it. This slide's up on our website here. It kind of exemplifies how our fire season ends. The median date for the end of the large fire season ends, as most people know here, from east to west, with the Eastern Plains pretty much winding down early to mid-June. Portions of central and western New Mexico winding down typically just a few days after the 4th of July. The eastern half or so of Arizona winding down in mid-July, and far western and western third or so of Arizona winding down in late July to early August. So in summary here, I'm not going to read through all these, but I'll just briefly summarize. The severe drought remains across the northern tier of the area right now. The fine fuels condition pretty much characterized by normal to below normal most areas, with the exception of the southern deserts of Arizona into southern New Mexico, with areas of record and near record fine fuel, both availability and continuity. So that could be a noteworthy take-home message for this year. A lot of the early season fire activity has been surrounding those areas so far. Seasonal temperature precipitation, generally temperatures were cooler than normal west of the divide, but overall big picture, temperatures have been close to normal area-wide for months. Slightly cooler across the west, as I just mentioned, more moist overall across the southern tier, drier further north, especially northern New Mexico. The spring and early season summer weather pattern, again, expecting this pattern to be quite variable as we go through the next 6 weeks or so. Just something I've been watching recently, again, that we're kind of transitioning from record heat right now across the area to more of a breezy pattern as we get into the weekend. And then as we get through next week, it kind of warms up a little bit further once again. Then we get some hints of moisture trying to come into the area from southeast to northwest. And then we get another upper level impulse that drives across the area. So really an up and down pattern. I think this could be perhaps a good pattern for some dry lightning this season out towards the Continental Divide area and up and down into Arizona, with intermixed with some wind patterns, some critical wind, low humidity patterns as well. So kind of a real smorgasbord of fire weather patterns upcoming likely this May into June. And for the monsoon, again, there's a lot of uncertainty with that, as there always is, but this year I'm expecting it to be timely overall and near to slightly below normal, with perhaps the better moisture centered from the divide eastward. And again, I already mentioned the bottom portion about the near to midterm focus across the southern tier of Arizona. That's panned out pretty well. So again, these are dated. I'm working on, Nick's actually working on their new forecast, which should be available in just probably tomorrow. But for May, this is still accurate. We have area southeast, 6 south, southeastern Arizona, and much of 6 north, PSA 6 north, in above normal significant fire potential for May. I'm also including 3, PSA 3, which is southwestern Arizona, and PSA number 2 in western Arizona in above normal significant fire potential for the month of May. So those areas will be also red for May. Overall, everything else will be normal. And as we get into June, I'm pretty much continuing that pattern with 2 PSAs 2, 3, 6 north, and 6 south in above normal significant fire potential for June. Also including the Coconino area in above normal potential, and likely PSA number 7, which is northwestern New Mexico for the month of June. And all those areas will continue into July in above normal status until we get some humidity increase associated with the monsoon, which typically happens pretty quickly, but some years it's a little bit slower to arrive. So we'll see how that goes this year. And I think, Zander, that's all I have. The next update I'll likely have on the web early next week. And I will also, I've been doing recording briefings for these too. So that'll also be on the internet likely early next week. And another update really briefly, I'm also working on doing some daily weather briefings as well, which will be posted up on our website. The first one should be perhaps up there later today. And I'm going to be probably doing those 2 or 3 days a week initially for the foreseeable future for this fire season. And that's all I have, Zander, unless there's questions for me.
Thank you so much, Rich. I really appreciate it. It's I guess the timing, maybe I should have waited till next week to host this webinar, but it is nice to have this preview, and then folks can turn to the update next week. And I think having gotten your explanation today, it'll be a little bit more clear. I think we have a couple minutes left, and what I'd like to do is turn to Brent Davidson, who's the District Fire Management Officer here in Region 3 on the Carson, and just talk about one other factor that's sort of building into our fire season, and that's COVID-19. And Brent doesn't have slides or anything, but I think this is more of a conversation. So we'll give him the floor for a few minutes, and then hopefully we'll still have a few minutes if folks have questions. And if you do have questions brewing, please go ahead and put them in the chat window, and we can kind of collect them up that way. So with that, Brent Davidson, I'll turn it over to you. You should be able to just unmute yourself. And yeah, good. Okay. And the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Zander. So once again, Brent Davidson, Deputy Fire Staff Officer for the Carson National Forest out here in Taos. I will start off my portion here just by saying that I am teleworking with my 2 little kids. So if you hear screaming in the background or there's an interruption, I apologize for that in advance. So just here to give a kind of a broad overview of some of the tactics and for fire response with COVID-19 and kind of the conditions we're in for this year. First off, the main thing that one of the first things to touch on is that, you know, typically here in the Southwest especially, we're able to take advantage of the correct conditions and natural ignitions to manage wildfire across the landscape, you know, to reintroduce fire and have a benefit for the ecosystem. And we're taking a pause on that this year for you know, a number of reasons, I'm sure, which all of you are fairly familiar with, but mainly just to reduce our firefighter and public exposure to COVID, and you know, just to focus on kind of a rapid response to any wildfire that we do have. So we're not looking to manage any wildfires across the landscape this year. So as I mentioned, also we're shifting to what we're calling a rapid response. So taking into consideration public and firefighter safety and what makes sense whenever we do have wildfires. We want to, contain them or control them, or do the right thing to make sure we respond to them rapidly. And once again, just with the overall objective of minimizing firefighter and public exposure and safety to all the things that are involved with wildfire response, and something that's turns into a longer duration incident or a larger incident where we have to have more responders there. So in a smart fashion, just responding to those incidents as rapidly as possible, and trying to keep their size on the smaller side if at all possible. One tool we have in the toolbox that you'll could potentially see out there is an increase in aviation usage, or more aviation available as we get into fire seasons across the country, just to increase with some of the on-the-ground exposure, and to try to minimize or try to assist with that rapid response kind of protocol that we're moving into. An overall just decrease in responder exposure. And we've gone through a lot of risk exercises, at the local levels and across forests and regions in the country, just to try to identify and mitigate and discuss all the risks that are out there. And, social distancing criteria, all the things that people are doing in normal, every day-to-day life, we're implementing a lot of those on the ground with our tactics in response to wildfire. Some of that's a little bit challenging to do, but we've got some very outside-the-box thinkers out there working on everything possible to just reduce exposure to COVID and keep people safe when they're responding to you. Some of those things are just not having, or trying to avoid at all costs having the traditional large fire camps that you see out there on bigger fires or longer duration fires, doing things more remotely, relying on our responders to be self-sufficient for longer, so they can stay on scene, or they can support themselves remotely on larger incidents, and just overall try to maintain the separation and the intermingling of responders on the incident. Kind of a cool thing with that is that all agencies are essentially on the same page with a lot of those tactics, and everybody's looking to just decrease that exposure across the board for all responders, and make that something that we all do kind of jointly, so that we're all on the same page as we respond to incidents. I don't have a whole lot more for the group outside of that. I'll answer questions as folks had them, but those are some of the main things that we're looking at right now. Just trying to be flexible and do the smart thing out there for the public and the firefighters. So,
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving that encapsulation of the plan. And it does seem, having listened to Rich and now listening to you, that there have been worse setups for this, right? Like, there have been some years at this time when we're looking at quite an active season, and it seems like, maybe more on the normal level. So at least hopefully we have that in our favor. I guess we're right at the top of the hour, so some folks might have to drop off, and I certainly understand that. We're really glad you were able to join today. Hopefully it was useful. And for those of you who can stay on a little bit longer, we might go another minute or two here, while trying to respect the fact that people are trying to both take care of kids at home and do work and all these things in our busy days. I did have one question for you while some other things come in here, and this was for Brent. So it seems like, on one hand, there's this sort of vision from the chief's office, I think, on not managing natural ignitions, but on the other hand, it seems like some of the emphasis on firefighter safety, keeping responders kind of out of the mix as much as possible, might end up having some of the same effect. I don't know, I guess, not being a firefighter myself, it seems like as we're kind of being a little bit more creative or using air resources a little bit more, we might end up with some bigger boxes for management, at least in areas where values aren't as under threat. Does that make any sense, or am I off base on that?
No, it does make sense. I guess, I kind of used the kind of a lot of what I said was broad terms, and I'll use another broad term here, but it's appropriate response. So, an appropriate response in one place may be rapid containment at a small size. An appropriate response in another place, the least exposure to the firefighters and responders may be a little bit bigger box and more favorable conditions to contain the fire, or to be able to control the fire, using road systems and such. So, rapid response is kind of a new key term. Appropriate response is something we've used in the past. It kind of just depends on the scenario, and something a little bit larger may be the best tactic to take in order to have the best results for, the responders, the community, and the landscape, I guess. So it's very free flowing at some points, or it takes a lot of case by case determination there. Does that answer your question?
It sure does. That makes a lot of sense. And Barb just typed in a comment that COVID-19 is giving community members even more reasons to enact programs like Firewise and make their homes, give them their homes some defensible space. And I think, that's true every fire season. We as residents in fire adapted ecosystems, we have to take responsibility. But I agree with Barb that when things are set up that might make things a little bit more challenging for responders, all the more reason to for us as residents to take responsibility. So thanks for sharing that, Barb. I think that's a great reminder. And I don't see other comments filing into the chat window, so I think I should let everybody go. And I really want to thank all our presenters, Mike Lynch, Rich Naden, Brent Davidson. I think this is a nice, complete overview, both kind of last year leading up to this year, and I feel like I have personally more information thinking about what the summer might look like. So thanks everybody, and recording will be available, and we will also probably try to follow up with some links to things like the fire season outlook that comes out later this week or next week. So thanks everybody, and with that I will close down the webinar.